I remember the first time I did a recording on one of these, I was at another extension office and I just hit record like normal, or I didn't know any better. Hit record. Well, it recorded to the cloud. Well, right after I got done with that particular meeting, I left and went home, I guess, or went back home. Well, apparently it didn't record right, so, but they told me I need to record it directly to my computer now. Take care of that problem. So, haven't had an issue since. So. Hey, Andy or Eldon, are you on?
Yeah, I'm on, Patrick.
Oh, okay. As first I'd seen of you, so that will make you. Whoops.
I see Eldon on there now too.
Oh, okay. Well, there we go. I guess I'm not seeing Eldon for some reason. Okay.
He was on his daughter's computer, Patrick. It doesn't have his name popped up.
Oh, yeah.
The first alert, Chief Meteorologist Ron Hurst. The news station alert has arrived for your area.
What'd you say?
So be prepared.
Andy, can you admit people? Or,
Yeah, I can. I have a
okay,
few.
just kind of watch that, because I think we're a little bit past 7 here. I think we'll go ahead and start.
Okay.
So I guess thank you all for being on tonight. I guess we'll go ahead and get started. We're a little bit past 7 here, but just want to thank you all for being on. My name is Patrick Davis. Work with University of Missouri Extension as a regional livestock field specialist down in Stockton. In the past, we've done this conference in person. But this year, things are a little different, and actually it worked out good to do it online, because probably if we had tried to hold it tonight in person, we wouldn't have been able to do it. So virus or no virus. So
Well, I think you're there.
the and so anyway, just want to thank you all for being on tonight. Actually, there's three of us that work together to plan this. Eldon Cole, who's on tonight, and Andy McCorkle, who's on. Andy will be helping me with the chat and those kind of things. And and Andy's, Eldon's a livestock specialist down in Mount Vernon, and Andy's a livestock specialist over in Lebanon. Just a couple of things before we get started here. If you've got any questions or anything, please put those in the chat and we'll answer those throughout the evening. Also, please keep your video off so we can kind of so hopefully we don't use too much bandwidth. Just keep your mics muted too, so we don't have any background noise or anything. And then of course, if you have a question or anything, type that in the chat there, in the chat button, and we'll try to answer those as best we can. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and start with the first talk that we're going to have this evening. So kind of the way this is going to run, we've got Eric Bailey, who's our state beef cattle nutrition extension specialist. He's going to give a talk this evening on stocker cattle systems in Missouri. And then Wesley Tucker is actually going to begin his talk tonight on, he's our ag business specialist, regional ag business field specialist with extension here in Bolivar. And he's going to talk this evening. He's going to begin his talk basically economics of stocker cattle operations, business management, any COVID-19 considerations that there might be related to stocker cattle operations, and those kind of things. And he'll talk for a little while tonight, and then on Thursday night we will have Jordan Thomas, who's our state beef cattle reproduction specialist, and he's going to talk about low input heifer development systems that produce profitable open feeder heifers. And then Wesley is going to talk again and kind of finish up his talk on Thursday night. And so with that, that's kind of how things are going to run. Of course, if you have any questions or anything, just ask or put them in the chat as you can. I'll put an evaluation together and send that out electronically. That'll do that on Thursday after the talks on Thursday. I sent out today Eric Bailey's talk that he's going to be giving tonight. Eric will also be on Thursday night if you have any questions for him as well. Wesley's talk, we will put that together and we will send that out Thursday night after that event. So with that, I think I've spent enough time talking, so I'll let Eric go. And of course, thank you again, Eric, for being on tonight. And he's going to talk about stocker cattle systems in Missouri.
All righty. Thanks for that introduction, Patrick. And thanks for everybody for coming and joining us tonight. If you could just right quick check and see if your mic is muted before we get started, I'd sure appreciate it. I think we're getting a little bit of background noise. So what I intend to do tonight for you all is to not give you an exhaustive look at every possible stocker cattle system that could be evaluated in Missouri, but I instead want to focus on a very specific stocker cattle system that I don't think we have thought about quite as much as we should here in the state to this point. And that stocker cattle system that I want to borrow from somewhere else to look at under our tall fescue forage systems here in Missouri is the intensive early stocker system that's used in the Flint Hills of Kansas quite extensively. Now, we'll get into what the intensive early stocker system is over the course of this presentation, but I'd like to make a few kind of broad comments that about how I've gotten interested personally and professionally in stocker cattle systems within the state. So my background is actually in off of a cow-calf operation in Northeast New Mexico. I've been around commercial cow-calf production my whole life. Very fond of that beef cattle enterprise. But there's some realities that we have to face when it comes to thinking about cow-calf systems, and in particular, the barriers to get into a cow-calf business, especially if you're a beginning farmer or rancher who's starting out from scratch. Now, I want to sort of frame our discussion around some of the work, the excellent work that Wesley and other colleagues in MU Extension do every year in terms of putting together these Missouri cow-calf planning budgets. Now, they produce a planning budget for both the southern half of the state and the northern half of the state. As we all know, I-70 sort of bisects the state into two very different production systems, and I've chosen to use the southern Missouri budget for tonight's conversation. A couple of things to point out off of this is that we're going to be looking at revenues and costs on a per head basis, and our estatiments of revenue on a per head basis for both spring and fall calving herds in 2021 are over $800 per cow. So at least on the surface, the revenue potential from a cow-calf operation looks pretty good. But there's some real limitations in so much as the revenue side is good, but we don't do a great job in the cow-calf business of knowing what our cost of production is. We also don't do a very good job in the cow-calf business of controlling costs. Now, if you were to take a step back and say, if I was going to get into the cow-calf business today and I was going to start from scratch, as you start to think about the assets that you've accumulated over your years in production, in terms of equipment, in terms of your herd, in terms of your land, all of those factors, it would require a substantial upfront capital outlay and or a pretty good relationship with a bank and a fairly sizable banknote to get started. And so, when it seems like throughout this presentation that I'm criticizing cow-calf production, it's not so much that I'm criticizing because I don't believe in that system. It's just that, at least from my perspective today, there's some real challenges to getting started in the business, and it all comes down to equipment, capital, and quite honestly, labor too, in some cases. Now, we spend a lot of time in the cow-calf business chasing revenue. We invest in superior genetics. We attempt to market value-added calves. We try to achieve, even today, I would say that one of the things we're doing is, and I applaud a lot of our producers for doing this, is we're really going for maximum value capture by entering into the marketing beef space rather than marketing and cattle. What that says overall, though, is that most folks are chasing additional revenue in terms of trying to improve their business, to sustain their business for the long term. They're chasing additional revenue, but my concern is that a lot of times we've created systems where we have to spend $1.25 to get an extra dollar. And so, in that case, our marginal cost is greater than our marginal revenue. Additionally, a lot of the systems we've set up have an annual cost associated with them that is significant. I mean, most of y'all have seen Cattle Facts or other popular press articles say that, an annual cow cost is, $600, $700, $800. I've seen estimates go all over the board in terms of what the annual costs to run a cow are for operations across the United States. But one thing I'll say is that I don't see anybody saying that it costs $200 or $300 to run a cow for a year. It's in fact, I believe some of the most recent estimates I saw would have our cost to run a cow over $800 a cow a year. So cow calf becomes a low margin business, not because of the revenue potential, but because of our lack of control on the cost side of things. We should take a step back though and think about what we're truly doing with our cow calf business. We are using cows as our equipment to harvest forage that's grown in our pastures, right? And so, we could harvest that forage with a tractor and a baler. We could harvest that forage in any number of different ways, but in a traditional cow-calf business, we've chosen to market that forage through these cows. Now, they do a lot of heavy lifting for us, but the question becomes, especially in our forage system, are they the best vehicle to market the forage that we can grow? Now, the reason that I want to bring that question to the forefront of y'all's mind and have a conversation about that for the next 30 or 40 minutes or however long it might go is because I think there's some unique aspects to the tall fescue forage system that are worth highlighting and bringing to light, and then talking about maybe some potential alternative ways to harvest that forage within the context of the yield curve that could benefit producers in the long run. Okay, so let's look at that yield curve. This yield curve is undoubtedly our greatest advantage in cattle production as a whole. Most other states and most other forage systems, you're talking about one annual, one long growing period per year. Where in the fescue belt, we get a spring flush. We also get fall regrowth as well. And oftentimes you could make the argument that fall regrowth is of tremendous value, particularly to our cow-calf operations, especially as we think about systems where we attempt to stockpile forage, where we try to extend the grazing season, and it really facilitates excellent fall calving production because we have relatively high quality forage for these cattle to graze. Even if we're calving in September or October, we have high quality forage to graze through the breeding season in December and into January. But the fall is not where I want to focus for now. I want to highlight that as a competitive advantage for tall fescue, but it's this spring flush that I think we need to really focus on tonight. Okay, and so one of the common concerns that folks will have with our spring flush and tall fescue systems is that oftentimes we have more grass than we know what to do with for about 60 to 90 days every spring. Now, why do we have that? Well, we have that because we have a set stocking rate on our land base every year if we're running a strictly cow-calf business. And so essentially what happens is the forage accumulates as the growth rate outpaces the demand from the livestock themselves. And so what we have done historically is when growth rate outpaces forage or demand by the livestock, we've harvested that forage, we've put it up as hay, and then fed that to livestock during periods of the year when the growth rate is little to non-existent. Now, that model has served us well for a long time, and I don't think that model is going away, but there are some real challenges with that model that I don't know if long-term profitability is going to be there. And I want to point out to y'all, when we do that, when we allow that spring flush to get ahead of us and mature and then harvest it later on, what we're doing is we're taking a product that had a substantial feeding value in April and May. We're leaving it in the field until June or July. We're harvesting it at a much lower quality at that point than we would have if we would have been able to harvest it earlier. And there's really not a better example of this than an extension bulletin that was put together by the University of Tennessee. They summarized some research where a large field of tall fescue was sectioned into thirds and harvested. Each third was harvested on a different date. In this case here, you'll notice there's really only about a 11 day difference between each date of cutting. Now this harvested forage was then cured, stored, and fed back to Holstein heifers afterwards, and I believe they were 400 or 500 pound Holstein heifers, and their performance was reported, and that's what you'll see on the middle columns on this table. Okay, so basically what you'll note is that the May 3rd harvest date, the heifers ate about 13 pounds of hay a day. That was offered free choice, no supplement, no nothing else. They just wanted to know what animal performance was on that forage itself. Those heifers gained about 1.39 pounds per day, and the percent TDN, or percent total digestible nutrients, our proxy for energy, was 68%. So high quality feed. Hay that was harvested 3 weeks later on May 25th, you'll notice that those heifers ate about 40% less hay than the ones that were fed, or heifers that were fed the May 25th hay ate about 40% less hay than the ones that were fed the May 3rd hay. Their gain was 0.4 of a pound versus 1.4 pounds, and their TDN was 12% units lower than the early May harvest. And so if you think about it, what happens, and the reason that this happens, is that when we get into late spring, we go from a vegetative state, a growth pattern that's dominated by lush, tender leaves, and we get into the reproductive stage of tall fescue growth, where we get more stems and seed heads relative to leaves produced. And so as that forage matures, quality goes down. And so in this case, our cow-calf system, we're harvesting the hay late. We're leaving some quality on the table. Now, the one thing that I will grant is that, if you'll notice that I conspicuously skipped the yield column there, and you'll notice that the yield in terms of pounds per acre, there was a difference of 1,500 pounds, 1,489 pounds cutting it on May 3rd versus cutting it on May 5th. So quantity is there, but quality is not there. Now, the question is the relevancy of that quality. If I'm feeding spring calving cows over winter, the hay that you see on the screen that was produced on May 25th is excellent feed. It will easily maintain body condition. I don't have a whole lot of concern about offering that to spring calving cows over the winter when they're at their lowest nutrient requirements. But that that stored forage does not match up well if I'm trying to feed that back to fall calving cows who are nursing a calf, who are in the process of becoming pregnant with next year's calf. So we've got this idea now of taking the forage, and rather than harvesting it mechanically, storing it, waiting for it to get to a lower quality so that we maximize tonnage, we're going to use an animal, and in this case, a stalker animal, to harvest that forage while it's growing, to maintain that forage in a vegetative state for a longer period of time. I want to walk you all through a case study here that I'm working with a guy on right now, and this case study is going to take place in 2021. So this is what you're seeing is essentially the planning or the background information on a stalker deal that's fixing to happen this coming year. Okay, so this is a Google Earth image of a farm that's being rented by a beginning farmer who is planning to turn stalker cattle out on it this spring. Okay, so the farm is about 275 grazable acres out of a total of 640 acres that's in the lease. There is obviously a significant tree, forest, wood component to this place. The pasture that's open, however, though, is a very well maintained fescue clover mix stand. Now, the farmer has negotiated a $12,000 annual lease over the entire farm. On a total acreage basis, that's about $18.50 an acre. It's a pretty good deal when you look at it over the whole footprint, but at least on a grazable acre perspective, we're looking at about a $43 per grazable acre. So, that is a rate that would be in line with what others are getting out on the market, but it's certainly not a screaming deal by any stretch of the imagination. Now, the person who's going to be operating this place, like I said, is a beginning farmer, zero equipment owned currently, very limited capital to operate. And so the plan in this case study, is to graze approximately 400 head of stalker calves, weighing initially around 500 pounds each at a rate of about roughly a steer and a half to the acre. And these calves are going to be turned out sometime between, let's say, St. Patrick's Day and the 1st of April, which is going to be entirely dependent on the weather. I'm encouraging them to turn these cattle out once we have about 6 to 8 inches of vegetative growth on the ground to make sure that we don't shortchange these animals. The operator has negotiated a custom grazing arrangement with a cattle owner. The business deal is going to be 40 cents per pound of gain. And so, that rate is probably lower than it should be. But because they're taking on a substantial number of animals from a single operator, there was some economies of scale that come into place. The stalker operator had to offer the cattle owner a cost of gain that would have been competitive with what they're doing on their own farm with these cattle. The other piece of this plan that's pretty novel relative to other stalker cattle systems in Missouri is that the plan is to feed zero supplement other than free choice mineral. For a long time, we've talked a lot about if you're going to run stalker cattle in Missouri, you need to be providing some supplement because cattle underperform the nutritive quality of endophyte infected tall fescue. Okay. Now, if you look at this plan and you do some projections on it, so the projected gain in this case is about 150 pounds. Now, the assumed number of days grazing is roughly 100. So that is $60 a head at that 40 cents per pound of gain with a pound and a half average daily gain. Now, some of you all might be saying a pound and a half average daily gain with zero supplement is simply not achievable on tall fescue forage system, but I have 2 years of research data that I'm going to share with you. And under a specific set of management practices that I believe to be real and believe that we can achieve it out in the real world. Now, it's important not just to look at gain per head when you're evaluating these stalker cattle systems. It's also important to evaluate our gain per acre. And the real competitive advantage that a Missouri stalker system has relative to anywhere else is that spring flush is so substantial that we can stock at rates that other states only dream of. Even, in the Flint Hills, A season-long stocker cattle system, we're looking at 4 acres per head. 4 acres per head. Here we're talking steers per acre, and we're shooting for a target of somewhere between 1.5 and 2 steers per acre in the system, basically to try and match forage growth rate with forage demand. Now that gain per acre is about $87 per acre, and the projected revenue off of this enterprise would be about $23,500, or roughly 2x what the rental payment is. An important question that y'all might be asking yourself right now is, well, why doesn't this operator just go out and buy 90 cows? Okay, so one, they're a beginning farmer with limited capital. But two, I want to show you all what some real quick and dirty cost, revenue, and cost projections might be for that 90 cow herd if we were if the operator was to go down that route. Now, if you go back to the cow-calf budget that Wesley and others have put together, they were projecting revenues for a spring calving herd of about $830 a head. If there's 90 head, that'd be a revenue of approximately $74,700, or roughly 3.5 times what the stockers are going to bring. Now, understand that $830 a head accounts for both calves and cull cows in the figuring. And so essentially, if you run these 90 cows on this operation for a year, you're going to get $74,700, but you're also going to be left with 77 head because the assumed cull rate was about 14%. Okay. Now, if we look at the cost side of this, so to go out and buy these cows, and I'm picking a number out of the air in terms of $1,500 per head in terms of cows. That's a on the low end of bred heifer. That's probably on the high end of mature cow cost, depending on what you do. Regardless, to go out and buy those animals, you're talking about $130,000 purchase price. And so, given that it's a beginning farmer and rancher, you're talking about, needing to go in with a bank to make this happen. To get a bank to loan on cows, you're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of about 30% equity in those cows. So the farmer would need, roughly $40,500 upfront just to buy the cows to run on this place. Leaving that $90-some thousand in the loan that still needs to be accounted for, an annual loan payment at 4% interest over a 5-year note, that's a $20,579 annual loan payment for each of the 5 years. Now, we haven't really talked about the cost side yet. I mentioned that it was high. MU extension budgets estimate the annual operating cost per cow at about $785, not counting labor. So in this case, if you use those numbers, and certainly there's a lot of discussion that we could have, and Wesley is going to bring more depth to this conversation than a nutritionist could. But if you use those numbers, for example, that's a $70,000 in total operating costs. And so, in this case, we end up having to put revenue in from outside the business to sustain it under these assumptions. The slide here, what I've got is simply a screenshot of the operating costs from the Missouri Extension cow-calf budget, just to give you an example. So when they added labor in, they estimated that if you go down to your bottom right-hand corner, that the operating costs per cow were about $908. And I've excluded $124 worth of labor because, let's be honest, most of us, when we're doing our cost of production, we're not charging ourselves labor. We're not we are essentially donating our time to the business. And so this number includes pasture, it includes feed, mineral, and stored forage, and so on and so forth, including cow replacement as well. Now, the actual pasture rental rate is $133 per cow in the example, the case study that I showed you. Now, I just left in that 147 here just so you all can see what extension is using and what, quite frankly, we're within 10%. So I didn't want to make it any more complicated than it had to be. So to kind of put this all together, if you look at it, the stocker cattle enterprise is going to generate roughly $23,500 in revenue, less $12,000 in rent. And we didn't really talk about it, but we're going to budget about, or the operator is going to budget about $6,000 for expenses. Now that leaves about a $5,500 net margin available. Plus, we haven't talked about any possible fall custom grazing opportunities that might be in existence, because we highlighted that fall flush of growth is a real competitive advantage. There's some real potential there to harvest that fall regrowth, whether that's through another custom grazing deal, whether that's through, I mean, quite honestly, through even baling it could potentially be an option. Now, on the cow side of things, you'll see that, 74,700 in gross revenue sounds impressive, but when you take off the 20,000 loan payment, when you take off the 70,000 in operating costs, you end up with a net margin of minus $16,522, plus the $40,000 up front that you needed in equity on the cow purchase. And so from that perspective, the stocker deal begins to look pretty attractive. Now, I really want to start to challenge some of those numbers and assumptions that I used in the case study with the operators, so that you all can see some context. We've been talking about fescue toxicosis in this state for 50 years now, and fescue toxicosis certainly is a real concern. There's classic pictures like this all over of cattle that are showing symptoms of fescue toxicosis, and I think it's pretty obvious which of the two steers pictured here on the slide is the one that's afflicted with fescue toxicosis. The unthrifty looking, mud covered, skinnier one on the left is the one that's afflicted with fescue toxicosis, which fescue toxicosis is overconsumption of ergot-like alkaloids that would basically make heat stress worse during the summertime. We've known about this for a long time, and this is a study right here that would show what the conventional wisdom is as it pertains to tall fescue and stocker cattle systems. So this study looked at 3 different forage sources. So endophyte infected tall fescue, which is highlighted as E+ fescue, E- fescue, which is endophyte free tall fescue, and then Max Q, which is a variety of novel or friendly endophyte fescue, or an endophyte infected fescue that does not produce these ergot-like alkaloids that cause so many problems within our livestock. Now, these cattle grazed on tall fescue pastures for 244 days. So March 30th to November 29th. And this was a study that was repeated for 3 years. So those are the average turnout dates and the average dates that the cattle were removed from the pastures. It's pretty obvious to see here that if you look at in terms of ending weight, average daily gain per acre, the E+ fescue, or the hot fescue, the endophyte infected fescue, lags far behind the endophyte free fescue and the friendly fescue, the friendly endophyte or the novel endophyte fescue. Cattle that were grazing the endophyte infected fescue weighed 150 pounds less than the E- calves and 161 pounds less than the novel endophyte fescue. And so the average daily gain is under a pound, where we're talking 1.58 to 1.62 pounds per day on the E- and the novel fescue. So from that perspective, why would I ever encourage anybody to go towards a stocker cattle system in this state that's based around E plus fescue? I think there's an important piece of context that's missing in a lot of the stocker work that we've done, however. The piece that's missing is that grazing period. You'll notice that we had a 244-day grazing period. And the idea or the novel concept that I want to bring to the fescue belt is to think about this intensive early stocker system to harvest that spring flush of growth and when at peak forage quality. But at the same time, the second thing that we do is we avoid the summer slump. Cattle in this study here would have gone right straight through the middle of the summer slump on these pastures. And so it's presumable that in July and August that, animal performance was little to none on the E plus fescue, because that summer slump is time of year that coincides with peak ergot alkaloid concentrations, that coincides with the lowest forage quality relative to the growing year. And so that avoiding that summer slump and harvesting that forage early might be a potential workaround.
Eric, I had a quick question come in, and I'm not, I'll just mention it. I'm not for sure how we'll answer it, but question came in and asked, how can I figure out which kind of fescue I have on my farm? Do you want to touch on that, or?
Yeah, so that's Patrick. Thanks for the question. So what I would tell you is how to know what kind of fescue you have on your farm. If the fescue has been around for a long time, I'd be willing to wager that it's more than likely endophyte infected tall fescue. Novel or endophyte free fescue is a relatively new phenomenon. Certainly the endophyte free fescues were promoted in the 90s, and over the last 15 or so years we've promoted the novel or the friendly endophyte fescues. The best thing you can do to find out what type of fescue you have on your farm is simply to collect individual plants and send them off to a diagnostic lab for analysis of the endophyte, the percentage endophyte infection. One of the things that we know is that in general, when fescue is over about 50% infected with the endophyte, average daily gain in stocker cattle decreases by about 1/10 of a pound a day for every 10% increase in endophyte infection. That's what conventional wisdom would say. Now, what some of those symptoms of fescue toxicosis you'll see are on the slide here. And so the greater the endophyte infection rate, the more pronounced that some of these symptoms might be if your cattle are grazing it. Now, I'm talking a lot about endophytes and alkaloids, and I realize that could be a bit abstract, but what I want to point out to you is that the endophyte is a fungus that's found in the stem, the leaf sheaths, and the seed of tall fescue. And it is a good thing in so much as it provides some real agronomic benefits to the plant. It provides protection against disease and pests. It provides some drought resistance. And in fact, one of the reasons that we have novel endophytes now is that initially the thought was, well, to get around the symptoms of fescue toxicosis, we'll just take the endophyte out of fescue and then we'll plant that. So the endophyte-free fescue was planted, but the problem that a lot of folks had was they invested substantial capital in renovating from an endophyte infected fescue to a non-endophyte infected fescue, and they saw that the persistence of those stands of the non-endophyte infected fescue were not great. I mean, the lifespan was much lower than the E plus fescue. And so that's what has pushed research towards trying to develop these novel endophyte fescue strains that will convey the agronomic benefits without producing substantial concentrations of those alkaloids that cause problems for our livestock. Now, the alkaloids are not present at all, or they're not present at the same concentration every month out of the year. And there's one chemical in particular that we've noted over time is related to fescue toxicosis, and that chemical is ergovaline. So this is some work that one of my former graduate students, Kevin Meng, did down at the Southwest Research Center over the past few years. We basically measured the ergovaline levels in fescue samples that we collected every month. Now, the study that we did is really kind of outside of the scope of the of tonight's talk. What I want to point out to you all is that we measured it every month from May to October. The red dotted line at the bottom is the ergovaline concentration at which it's thought that animals begin to show symptoms of fescue toxicosis. Now, the line, the 4 treatment lines, so the monthly ergovaline concentrations existed above that red line the entire 6-month period. And you'll note that there was a drastic drop from June to July. The only reason there was a drastic drop from June to July is that we actually went into the field and we harvested all the forage off of that field. And you know, you all have probably heard clip seed heads, harvest excess forage as hay to reduce some of the symptoms of fescue toxicosis. Well, you can see that we dropped alkaloid concentration substantially, but they continue to increase over time. And so this ergovaline is the issue that we run up against when it comes to trying to implement these stocker cattle systems. And one of the reasons, quite honestly, that a lot of folks have recommended supplementation of stocker cattle systems historically on tall fescue. But again, the thing that we're trying to do different is we're trying to look at a shorter duration grazing system relative to what I've got up on the screen here again, which was an 8-month grazing period. So some more work that Kevin did as part of his master's thesis was we evaluated, we set out actually to evaluate an herbicide, metsulfuron, that is known to suppress seed head production in tall fescue systems. Y'all might know it as chaparral. We wanted to know what the impact of chaparral and nitrogen fertilizer might be in these tall fescue forage systems. And we set up this grazing study initially with the goal of investigating that relationship, but what we actually stumbled upon was maybe some renewed interest in this intensive early stocker concept. And the reason for that is that we actually took cattle in for this study on the gain. We did a custom grazing arrangement with a local producer down in Southwest Missouri. And when we were designing this trial, I didn't want to subject the stocker cattle to the rigors of the summer slump. I basically wanted to make some quick gains on the animals, do our study, and then get them off so that we didn't have reduced performance. Well, what I wasn't thinking about when I planned the study back in 2018 was that we were essentially setting up an intensive early stocker system. So there were 16 pastures that were each about 4.5 acres of K31 fescue. Now, remember, I said that the endophyte infection, the greater the endophyte infection rate, the worse animal performance usually is. And that threshold is when we get above 50% endophyte infection rate, animal performance decreases. This fescue was 88% endophyte infected. And one of the things that I will really compliment the Southwest Research Center on is that they have some of the cleanest fescue pastures, E plus or endophyte infected tall fescue pastures anywhere to do research. There was minimal clover in these pastures. We threw 100 quarter-meter frames or quadrats out and then assessed the botanical composition of the forage in those 100 frames. on average across the 16 pastures, only 8 out of 100 frames had any kind of a clover or forb component to it. Now, in our study, we applied either no chaparral or metsulfuron, or the metsulfuron with either 0, 60, or 120 pounds of nitrogen per acre, which was applied on March 11th of each year. And the metsulfuron was applied on tax day, basically. One of the things that I'll point out that I think is a real limitation of this data set is that for metsulfuron or for chaparral to work, you have to apply it as close to the reproductive stage or the boot stage in tall fescue growth. So if you apply it early, you're not going to see the same level of seed head suppression that you would as you apply it later in the season. And so you're typically going to be encouraged to apply this herbicide in, at least in Southwest Missouri, in the middle of April. And so we turned steers out about 72 hours after application, and we grazed them for 57 days. Let's look at the performance of these animals now. Okay, so this is the sum of 2 years of performance. Now, as you can see, the gains from April 18th to May 17th from the first 30 days were outstanding on the 3 treatments where we applied chaparral. And still, relative to what other data sets would show, are still good for the negative control where we had no chaparral, no nitrogen. Now, our performance was cut by more than half from May to June. And overall, during this grazing period, we see that the cattle gained about, on the negative control, the no chaparral, no nitrogen, 1.5 pounds a day. With the chaparral, they gained about 1.8 pounds per day. Now, the question that might be in your head right now is, it looks like the chaparral did better and the nitrogen did better than the negative control. Why wouldn't you be recommending this? Well, we spent about, let's see, I'm trying to remember the numbers now. I believe we spent about $23 per head in nitrogen and fertilizer. So these pastures were stocked at 1.5 steers per acre. So that number is actually closer to $40 an acre, but it was about $23 a head overall. And over that grazing period, we got essentially about an additional 26 pounds of weight gain in the animals. If you look at that 40-cent custom grazing rate, we basically made about $12 in additional revenue from the chaparral and nitrogen application, but we spent $23 to get there. So that was one of those where the cost outweighed the benefit that we got out of it. And the reason why I'm talking more about that gold bar, that negative control, relative to the treatments that we applied in this particular study. So I've talked a lot about intensive early stocking, and I'm kind of sort of burying my lead at the end of my presentation, but I want to at least close out with, really driving home what this intensive early stocker concept is, so that you all can walk away with a better understanding. So this idea was really championed for a long period of time by Clinton Owensby at the Kansas State University. And this is a very common practice in the Flint Hills of Kansas today. And so if you were to compare stocker cattle systems of season long versus intensive early, at least in Kansas, let's take an example. And let's say you have 400 acres. You're going to split half of it into a season-long stocker system. You're going to split half of it into an intensive early. In a season-long grazing system, at least in the Flint Hills, you're looking at turning cattle out, around the 1st of May. You're pulling them off around the 1st of October. In intensive early, you're basically pulling cattle off in the middle of July. And so your grazing days are going from 150 down in the season-long to 75 in the intensive early. But the beauty of what you're doing with the intensive early is you're turning out twice the number of animals for half the time. And so your stocking rate is, in the season long, 4 acres per steer. And in the intensive early, It's only 2 acres per steer. The reason that this idea was championed by Dr. Owensby is that they found during their stocker cattle research, they were going in and weighing cattle every month. And what they found was that 2/3 of their animal gain occurred in the first half of the season. So that led them to test varying stocking rates during that first half of the season. And regardless of their stocking rate, whether it was 4 acres, 3 acres, 2 acres, animal performance was the same. So it led them down this road of utilizing this intensive early stocker model. And I want to share some of Dr. Owensby's data with y'all here. This is a 10-year study that was published back in 2018. What I've got in this table here, and apologies, I know there's a lot of numbers and it looks a little busy. This table is our gain per head. I want to draw your attention down to the bottom of the table, and you'll notice that in the season-long stocking system, animals gained on average over the 10 years of the study about 300 pounds when they grazed from May 1 to October 1. And in the intensive early, they gained about 200 pounds grazing from May 1 to July 15th. Okay. If you look at it on a gain per acre rather than a gain per head basis, though, same data set, let's go down to the bottom and look at the average. On average, in terms of gain per acre, the season-long system was 75 pounds of gain per acre, whereas the intensive early stockers program was 100 pounds of gain per acre. So you got 25 pounds more gain per acre, 33% more gain per acre in half the time by running twice the animals out there, by harvesting the forage when it was at its peak forage quality, by better matching forage growth rate and forage demand by your grazing livestock. And so that's represents an optimization of the system and capturing that forage during a period of time when it's at its peak forage quality. And so the way I see it, to sort of start to wrap this thing up, is I think we have a tremendous opportunity in Missouri to harvest the spring flush of tall fescue with growing calves, regardless of our fescue system, whether that's endophyte infected or non-endophyte infected or novel endophyte infected. I also think I'm passionate about this system because, you know, I'm a young beginning farmer and rancher myself, and this custom grazing stocker cattle on leased land is a really low barrier to entry into the cattle business. And I think that a lot of our problems in the cattle business in general are the fact that it's getting more difficult to bring new people into new businesses into the fold because of the capital and the equipment requirements. You know, the custom grazing deal that I've outlaid for you here tonight is not a 12-month enterprise. I'll tell you that 40-cent cost of gain, had that person had the opportunity to go back and renegotiate it, that would be renegotiated much higher today than it was then. That rate was negotiated last fall before the corn market went crazy. A custom grazing rate should be a win-win situation for both the custom grazer and for the cattle owner. Now, how you make it a win for the cattle owner is you offer them cost of gains that are cheap relative to what they could do in their own backgrounding operations and also what could be done in a feedlot. Feedlot cost of gains right now, because of the rapid escalation in corn prices, have increased big time. You know, we're seeing feedlot cost of gains that are near $1 right now. And so now, certainly we're not going to finish cattle on pasture, but a good rule of thumb to use is that your stocker, your backgrounding cost of gains should be about 2/3 the cost of a feedlot cost of gains. So that would put you more in line with like 60 to 65 cents custom grazing rate. So that's the cost per pound of weight gain. Now, the other thing about the system that I've set up at the Southwest Center that we've seen such promising results from is that it's a straight fescue monoculture and it's highly endophyte infected. Somebody who's managing for some diversity, for some clover, some forb component to their pastures, I'm hopeful that you'll see greater than 1.5 pounds average daily gain with no supplement in a fescue clover forage system. Another thing to point out is that, the Southwest Center program that we've got going on, they're open pastures, there's minimal shade, there's other aspects to it that lead me to believe that implementation on the farm has even greater potential than what we've seen in our data to this point. Now, the stocker cattle enterprise, though, for somebody who has been a traditional cow-calf producer, I wouldn't be surprised to see, there be some real sort of barriers in your mindset about it because of the relative risk of running stocker cattle. The things that I'll tell you in terms of my tips on how to lessen the risk with stocker cattle is not to take cattle straight out of the sale barn and turn them out in the pasture. If you're going to do a custom grazing deal for somebody else, make sure that they send you cattle that have been backgrounded for at least 60 days. Let them deal with the health challenges and the straightening cattle out and the doctoring and all of that stuff, and have them send you cattle that have been through the worst of their health challenges. The thing that I'm concerned about in this case study that I showed you all tonight is fly control, pink eye. Certainly we've had a lot of problems with pink eye in the state last year and over the last couple of years. I highlight stockmanship. Running these, some of these stocker cattle can be a fair bit harder to handle than, gentle old mama cows. They can be a little flightier. And so, and because of that, not just stockmanship, but fencing is a concern. This is not a place that you want to turn a bunch of wild cattle out with pretty poor fences. The ideal situation, you've got a good solid 5-strand perimeter fence, and you're not going to be running around chasing them all over the county. And for that matter, the topography is too, being able to, if you take these stocker cattle and turn them out in the Ozarks in the woods, you may never find them again, just because they get feral and they get really difficult to gather out of the woods. Now, the other thing about lessening your risk is that if you've already got a novel endophyte fescue, I think the potential is very high, just because you'll performance across cow-calf, across other stocker systems is shown to be better with the novel endophyte fescue relative to the K31 fescue. So sorry, I went a little bit long there. I knew I had a lot to cover. I apologize. I'd be glad to take a couple questions now, or if we need to get on to Wesley's talk, Patrick, I can do it after, however you want to play it. But regardless, thank you all for being here tonight.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. There is a question here. Do you have similar budgets developed for stockering poor body condition score coal cows on intensive graze tall fescue?
So I do not, and I don't know, Wesley, do y'all have that?
Well, we have the backgrounding and stocker budgets in there. We don't have a budget on the cow calf or on the coal cow angle, but we do have the same budgets we put up each year for stockers. We don't have it on a short season intensive one, though.
Any other questions for Eric? Not seeing any. Eric, thank you for talking tonight. And you said you'd be on Thursday night if we had any other questions. And so again, thank you again, Eric, for being on tonight. We're gonna move on now and talk. Wesley's going to talk. As I said earlier, he's ag business specialist in Bolivar. He's going to talk about economics of backgrounding stockers. And so, Wesley, you can start, I guess.
Can you see my screen okay, Patrick?
Yep, I can see it.
Okay. So, I think Eric pretty much stole all of my thunder pretty much here. So there's not a lot for me to cover, but no, I just had to give him a little bit of a rib there. But as Patrick said, my name is Wesley Tucker, ag business specialist and part of the Division of Applied and Social Sciences. You know, I did want to back up. I know Eric has already showed you our budgets, our cow-calf budgets, but I wanted to back up and go through just a few things there. And he did a really good job of highlighting several of those things. You know, when Eldon Cole and I and Joe Horner put these together each year, we catch an awful lot of grief because of the large numbers that we put in there. But I wanted to back up and just talk a little bit about how we come up with some of those total costs. So yeah, Pat, you know, Eric talked about the pasture and the feed cost and stuff, but we do put things in there like the labor, the $124 per cow labor that most of you won't include in your individual budgets when you make it. We put about $100 per cow for machinery and utility expenses. And I'll be honest with you, this is a bare bones machinery expense when we put it in there. This essentially is one tractor, one pickup truck, an ATV, and a stock trailer. And so the reality is when you think about our machinery lines that we have, and I don't care what color of machinery you have, it typically is much, much higher than that. We also include cow replacement cost in there. And you might say, well, why do you have $200 in there for cow replacement? This is going to be something we're going to talk about again next week when Jordan is talking about heifer development. But just to give you some quick and dirty cowboy math, if you take the cost of whatever replacement animal you're going to use, whether it is a heifer or a bred female, whatever that cost of that animal is, and then take it times your cull rate. So let's say you could buy a bred female for 1,300 times 15%, that's 195 bucks. So I would argue that most of us have a very difficult time getting our cow replacement costs below $200. And the only reason why that left-hand column there is 188.50 is because that is the fall calving column, which does have a lower cull rate essentially than that 15%. But most of us spend at least a couple $100, whether it is buying replacements or raising them ourselves. We also have, you know, somewhere around $120 to $125 in ownership cost, meaning that interest that Eric kind of mentioned, you know, taxes and insurance, things like that. You may or may not include those in your budget, but the reality is those are all very, very real cost. You know, so you might ask, okay, Eric's just showed me what the economics of a stocker system is compared to a cow-calf. Why do we have cow-calf operations in southern Missouri or North Missouri or wherever you are from? I'm one of you. I'm a cow-calf producer myself. I'm married to a veterinarian. So why do we have these operations around here? But you might say we're hopeless addicts. But there is something to be said about that idea of cash generation versus wealth accumulation. And the reality is most of our cow-calf operations, you know, we are a wealth accumulator. Our land doubles every 10 to 12 years, essentially, in value. And so we make more money off of appreciation typically than we do generating cash each year. And he's exactly right. It's a significant barrier to entry for a beginning farmer. But, you know, if you think about it, I have always said that this idea of our fescue growth curve is our biggest challenge to profitability, because the number one question I have to ask is how many cows should I have? Because that line there, that herd feed requirement line, you know, a cow has to eat every day she's alive. If she goes very many days without eating, she doesn't do very well. So she has to eat. We keep telling the agronomists they need to design a grass for us that will grow the exact same amount every day of the year. They turn and tell the livestock guys that they need to design a cow that can eat a lot in the spring and then, you know, not too much during the summer, and then can go all winter without eating. Neither one have been successful. So this is your real challenge in the fescue country of how are we going to feed an animal that needs to eat 365 days a year? Well, the reality is the most way we've done it for the last 50 years is we harvest all of that excess forage of the spring flush. And then, as Eric said, we feed it during the winter. But the thing is that really the most profitable place for a cow-calf producer to be? Because, you know, Eric has talked about the idea of the profitability in the stocker system versus cow-calf. the reality is I know all of you on this call that have cows are not going to turn around tomorrow and sell all of the cows that you have. So where can we figure out how to make this blend in and make the overall operation more profitable? Well, if you think back to that budget that we just showed on the very first slide here in my presentation, the feed cost getting her through the 90 to 100 days of winter is more than the whole other cost for the 9 months out of the year. 62% of the total cost, actually. So 62% of the cost of keeping a cow alive comes in January, February, and March. Okay. And if you think that sounds crazy and high, and if you think Eldon and I's numbers are high, I went back and just pulled the Kansas Farm Management Association numbers for a 5-year average just to compare. So they actually have in KFMA is what it's called, Kansas Farm Management Association. They have 80 farms that put their records in each year. They average 133 cows over the 5-year average. These are actual records. These aren't budgets. These are actual records, farm records that went into this system to calculate these numbers. And if you look at their numbers, their total cost numbers, their operating costs are actually higher than ours. But if you look at theirs, once again, the amount of stored feed cost to get through the winter is 62% of the total feed cost for the entire year. So just keep that in the back of your mind that we are spending more for January, February, and March than we are the entire other 9 months out of the year. Not only spending more, we're spending 12% above that amount. So, one time we have to think about how do I make money in this system if those animals have to eat every day of the year? Well, one thing we can do, and I've made this statement in every grazing school practically that I've taught, is we can lower that herd requirement so that we don't have to harvest as much stored feed in the spring flush, and we get our stocking rate more in line with what we can stockpile forage to get through the winter in. If you could think about reducing the number of mouths that you have to have for 365 days a year, that was put us more in line with what we need to have to be able to effectively graze through the winter. And we've just seen that the winter feed cost is the most expensive thing that we can put through the animal. Someone one time asked me, they asked me whenever I was doing a presentation on leasing ground, they asked me, they said, well, how much can you actually afford to pay for leased ground? And I said, if you can rent the farm next to you, you can pay $100 an acre for it, note without batting an eye. And they looked at me like I was crazy. And I said, well, let's just do some real simple cowboy math. A cow is going to eat a minimum of 1,000 pounds of hay per month. I would argue that she will generally, if you include waste, and if she has a calf on her, especially a fall calving cow, they'll eat a lot more than that. But a bare bones minimum is 1,000 pounds of hay per month. Let's say you can buy that hay bale for $35. I don't know where you find a 1,000-pound bale of good, decent hay for $35 today, but let's say you could. And let's say you feed one bale in January, one bale in February, one bale in March. So $35 times 3 bales is $105. I showed those boys that asked me, I said, you can pay $105 to rent the farm next to you if you only use it for 3 months out of the year, and you're still better off than feeding hay. And the reality is at 105, again, as I said, most people are going to feed way more than that 1,000 pounds of hay by the time they consider wastage in that. So the reality is it's probably closer to $200 to $250 per cow per year that we spend on that stored feed. So I don't tell any of the people that I rent from that they should be charging me $200 per acre. But if I only use that acre for those 3 months out of the year, that's what it would be worth for me to keep that cow through the winter. So what about, thinking about going back to this idea of lowering that requirement, that stocking rate being the most critical decision I think that you will probably make? Well, the beauty of what I love about Eric's presentation is this goes exactly back to what I've been promoting for a very long time, is the idea of what if, rather than just having a lower stocking rate of cows, I bring in some other enterprise in the spring to harvest that excess forage rather than baling it all up as low quality hay and then feeding it back out all winter. Because see, again, if I lower that stocking rate, I don't need to bale as much of that hay. and I can utilize those calves to harvest that extra feed for me. So Eric has just proposed exactly what I think is the ideal scenario for a cow-calf producer as well. You don't have to get rid of all your cows, but you will need to get rid of a few of them and not worry about baling quite so much hay, but using those short season stockers that he talked about from late March to July 4th. I think that fits exactly perfectly with our cow-calf model as well. And it's going to fit really well with actually not next week, actually, I guess Thursday, when we talk about the heifer development enterprise that goes with it as well. It also, that leads well to creating the perfect drought management system for us, because the reality is in Southern Missouri, folks, we're going to have a drought every few years. We had one in 2012, we had one in 2018, and I'll argue we had one in 2020 in parts of our area, as well as about all of us had a significant dry period in the fall where we weren't able to create much fall stockpile. So the idea of having a lower stocking rate puts me more in line with a drought management plan. Because if I'm up there on that dotted yellow line with the maximum number of cows that I can run by harvesting all this extra as hay and then feeding it in the winter, versus if I get a dry period, what am I forced to do? Well, I'm forced to sell cows. Well, if I'm on this black line that I've got a lower main stocking rate for the majority of the year, but I utilize maybe my backgrounding my fall-born calves during the spring of the year, or even bringing someone else's stockers in, then those are what we call disposable mouths. And disposable mouths can get loaded on the truck at a moment's notice without getting into our cow herd that we've tried to build up our genetic line for a very, very long time. Every farm operation needs to have a few animals identified that those are the disposable critters that can go on the truck at a moment's notice if it starts to get dry. Well, adding the short season stocker enterprise into your cow-calf enterprise is a built-in drought management system that gives us the flexibility. Patrick said I was going to mention something about COVID. Just think about this spring when the markets got disrupted by what was happening. Those that could hold on to those calves a little bit longer, the market was able to bounce back at least a portion of what it lost over time. But those that were at maximum stocking rate and had to go ahead and sell those animals, unfortunately, took a pretty big hit there in a very short amount of time. So, as an ag economist, I look at the difference in the different weight categories on prices of calves over time, just looking at the difference between a 3 to 4 weight and a 4 to 5 weight. And I spend a lot of time studying those. So I want you to think about this real quick. I want you to understand how value of gain is calculated. So if I could buy a 500-pound calf today for $2 a pound, or maybe I have a 500-pound calf already and I can sell it for $2 a pound, and I'm going to keep that calf for an additional 100 pounds and sell it as a 6 weight for $1.80, is that 100 pounds of calf I'm going to put on that animal, is it worth the $2 a pound he's worth today? Is it worth the $1.80 that I'm going to sell him at as a 6 weight? Or is it the average of the two, or some real low number of 80 cents? It really doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? Well, the reality is 500 times $2 is 1,000. 600 times $1.80 is 1,080. So the calf goes up 100 pounds, but he only goes up in value of $80 or 80 cents a pound. So if you understand what I've just told you, you now have the framework of that a lot of people don't understand, because they will come in and say, well, calves are bringing $1.50 a pound or $1.80 a pound, so every additional pound I put on that calf is worth what he's bringing. No, because there is a price slide, and that price slide is dependent upon the season, upon the weight of the cattle, and the cost of feed. Eric just mentioned that price of that corn is absolutely critical for what that value of gain is going to be worth, what the feedlot or the buyers, whenever I take that calf to sell it, are going to be willing to pay for it. And just to show you what I'm meaning, we were doing a backgrounding workshop this spring back in May, and so I pulled the weekly market report, and at that time, the difference between a 5 weight and a 6 weight was 67 cents a pound. This fall, we were doing a backgrounding workshop, and when I pulled it there, the difference between a 5 weight and a 6 weight was $1.24 a pound. It varies throughout the year. It varies based on the weight category that we're looking at. But if we look at the differences between those prices, this is just simply, again, this is the last decade from 2010 to 2019, the last decade of prices. You can see that the lighter weight calves typically peak in the spring, which we all know that, grass fever hits and everyone wants to buy these lightweight calves to turn them out on grass. But the good news is the heavier a calf gets, the more valuable it gets worth later in the year, because that corresponds to the difference between the April fats market and the June fats market. The reality is the majority of the country still calves in the spring and weans in the fall, so that we have a heavy feedlot heavy feedlot turnouts. The animals reach their finished weight in the summer. So if you look at the markets, there's a huge difference between the June fat market and the April fat market. So the good news is the heavier a calf gets, he gets more valuable in the fall, which does really good to thinking about buying these calves in the spring and putting more weight on them and selling them later in the fall. So what this chart right here is, and I'm going to introduce this to you and talk a little bit about it tonight, and then I'm going to kind of come back to talking a little bit more about it next week. I keep saying next week, I'm sorry, Thursday, when Jordan's talking as well. But basically, the way you read this chart is this is the value of gain over the last decade for different weight categories of calves and starting in different months. So looking at the very top left number here, this is saying if I am starting in January with a 350-pound calf and knowing what he is worth today, and then selling him 2 months later, 100 pounds heavier, what has the market paid me? Well, for the last 10 years, the market has paid me $1.85 a pound, or $185 per hundredweight, to put 100 pounds on a 350-pound calf starting in January. And this is over time. This is looking forward into 60 days into the future, or actually 60 days looking back, depending on how you like to look at that. But it is not the difference between the weight categories only today. It is actually, if I started in January and I sold that calf in March, what has the market paid me over the last 10 years for that additional 100 pounds of gain? And one of the things that you can see is it does change based on the season and the weight category. So let's just look at what Eric has proposed. Let's look at starting. He said, let's start in late March. He said a 500-pound calf. I'm going to say a little bit, most of our fall-born calves are going to be a little bit lighter than that. So let's say you've got a 450-pound calf in the month of March. The market has paid me for the last 10 years $105.89 to take that calf from 450 pounds to 550 pounds. And then let's take him one step further. He's now in May as a 550. The market has paid me $90 to take him from 550 to 650. Basically what Eric was saying, he was saying 90 days. Because these are in 100-pound increments, I have to say 120 days. But basically, over that 4-month period, the market in the last decade has paid me $196 to put 200 pounds on that calf, or essentially $1 a pound. Okay. If I started with that same weight category in the fall for a springborn cow-calf operation, if I started in November at weaning time, the market has paid me $155 essentially to put 100 pounds on a 450-pound calf. And then that calf becomes worth as a 550, the market has now paid me $120 to take him from 550 to 650 for $275 for that additional 200 pounds. So one of the things we're going to talk a little bit about next week is how do we meld these together? The market does pay me different amounts at different times of the year. And there's no doubt it costs more to put it on in the winter. So like Eric was saying, that fall grass is actually worth more than the spring grass. But again, we grow more of it in the spring. So the market has typically paid me almost $300 to put that 200 pounds on in the fall. So about $1.40 a pound. One of the things that you will find is if I look at the lighter weight categories, the market pays me more to put that gain on the lighter weight categories. Which ones are the cheapest and most feed efficient to put gains on? Well, the lighter weight categories actually are the cheapest cost of gains, and they pay the best. So one of the things, and this is going to sound a little crazy to some of you, but when you start looking at those on those lighter weight category calves, rather than start getting to that trying to get to that 450-pound calf in March that can start into Eric's system, the market has actually paid me $1.85 a pound to get it from 350 to 450. Well, what about every one of us have some calves out there, some on cows that just really aren't doing their good full job that they should as an employee for us. We've all got 10 to 15% of our cows out there that just really aren't cutting the mustard. But, as long as they get bred back, as long as they produce a calf horse, yeah, it's 100 pounds lighter than all the buddies in the herd, but, it's still a live calf and we really don't want to replace her. Well, thinking about what that does, what that 100 pounds on a fall-born calf or 141 on a spring-born calf, what about if I went in and early weaned those smaller calves it's not their fault. Now there's calves out there that's gotten sick and they're dinks because they're always going to be dinks. But I'm talking about the calves that it's not their fault they're 100 pounds lighter than their comrades. It's their mama's fault that she's not producing the milk that she should, or maybe he's on a first calf heifer that's at a disadvantage, or maybe it was a twin. But we all know that the price of cull cows dropped significantly from August to October, don't we? We all know that. I mean, and Jordan's going to talk next week about raising heifer replacements to replace some of these cows that we really ought to get rid of. But what about the idea of going in and early weaning those calves so that we can sell that cull cow when she's worth something, so that we can sell her when she's worth something, and put that additional 100 pounds of gain on those calves to get them up to more that desired category of 450 to 550 pounds. And let's look at what if I did for a fall calver trying to get her into Eric's, short season stocker window. What if I went back and looked at backing up and really saying, well, what if she's 200 pounds smaller than it should be? If I went back and started in November, the market has paid me $190 to put 100 pounds on a 350-pound calf. And then look at that January, pays me another 190. That's looking at $386 that I can look at. Actually, that's a mistake on mine. That box there should be over to the 150. So you're going to have to take $330 off of that. But that should be about $350 that market has paid me to put 200 pounds on a lighter calf to get him up to that desired weight of 550 pounds. Then what I need to do is making sure, as I said, if I early wean that calf, that I let that calf go and let it get to market, let that cow go on and become someone else's problem and replace her with a higher genetic heifer or a better bred animal to go into my herd. But, thinking about trying to get those animals caught up so that they can be sold with some of the others. And I actually, have seen this put into action where people early wean calves and put some additional feed into them. Those are the ones that will respond better than even, they'll respond with a better gain than their bigger comrades. So, Eric already mentioned, has anyone looked at the cost of feed lately and what it has done, the cost of corn? Well, as corn goes up, as that feedlot cost of gain gets more expensive, as he just said, that makes our grass more valuable. And it makes this idea of putting additional gain on calves more valuable to the cow-calf producer. So I'm going to say to be continued. I'm going to continue with this presentation on Thursday, but I just really want to challenge you to think about, as a cow-calf producer, who gets the most valuable grass that I can produce. And I think that we can look at a system that becomes more profitable with a few less cows, gets us more drought resilient, and puts a better system in place for me to be able to manage my forage operation, but allows me to still do a lot of the things that Eric has just suggested, of creating a system that allows me to put cheap gains on calf and capture high value values of gains from them at the same time. Patrick, I will turn it back to you.
Thank you, Wesley. Does anybody have any questions or anything? Not, I don't see any. Like I said earlier, Jordan and Wesley will be speaking again on Thursday night, and Eric will also be on Thursday night to answer any questions if you have any. And so, again, we'll be continuing this workshop or this conference on Thursday night, where Jordan Thomas, who's our state beef cattle reproduction specialist, will be talking about low input heifer development systems that produce profitable open feeder heifers. And then Wesley will continue his presentation as well on Thursday night as well. We will be also, I recorded the presentation tonight, and so you should be receiving that the same way that you received the invitation, or once you registered, you got a link to the meeting. I'm recording the meeting tonight, and so you should be receiving the recording that same way. I will work on getting that sent out. Try to get that sent out tomorrow or definitely by Thursday. If you missed anything or have any questions or anything. And so with that, I want to thank you all for being on tonight. And
Hey, Patrick.
Yes.
There is one question. There is one question
okay,
in
sorry.
the chat that we probably want to touch on.
Okay. Any data on cost effectiveness of warm season grass establishment?
Yeah, I don't know if Eric wants to talk on this but I will jump in here and say that's a fantastic question, James, and I think that is an excellent addition to the tall fescue system to think about establishing warm season grasses and how we can take advantage of those gains as well, whether you're looking at the cow-calf system or the stocker system. But yeah, that to me, that is the natural next step. Eric has put forth, and as I said, I should shut up and let him talk, but Eric has put forth the system of how we capitalize on the spring flush of fescue. To me, the obvious next step is, can we then transition them over into a small percentage of our acres being on warm season grass and continuing taking them even bigger? Because one of the things that you will find from the data is the idea, as I said, of the heavier I can get that calf in early fall, those gains become even more valuable. When you look at that chart, we start getting into $1.30 a pound and higher to get that calf up to that 750 and then 850 pound to get him poised so that he can become an April fat instead of a June fat. So I think taking it over into the warm season grass is the logical next step if we can develop it.
So I'm going to be the maverick here. One of my big concerns with talking about reestablishing pastures into, any kind of forage, whether that's warm season grasses, novel endophyte fescue, one of the real barriers that I see in going down this route is you're taking it out of production for at least 1 year, along with a multi-$100 investment in that land. And so that just creates another barrier to entry. You understand that I'm coming at it as a 35-year-old guy who's trying to get in the business. So I look at it from a little different lens, and in so much as I can't pencil buying the land in the first place. So renovating it, then I guess it just, the math doesn't quite add up in my head. A lot of the spirit of my talk tonight was to try and figure out how we can better manage what we have already rather than renovate. So that's probably not the answer that you were looking for to the question, but that's my perspective, at least in terms of these continuing to chase improved pastures and forage agronomy rather than, basically converting sunlight into steak using some type of grass as our medium.
There was another comment put down there about warm season annuals, maybe another opportunity as well.
I completely agree with that. That's the beautiful thing about this forage system is that we can dream about just about anything up and implement it in a part of the country where we get 40 plus inches of rain per year, where we have, lots of agronomic capabilities. So I'm in complete agreement with that comment.
With that, I don't.
Me. This is Nina. I have an older farm, and I know that I have ergo infected fescue. And my question was on the advisability of trying to reestablish. I wanted to tell Eric, thank you for his input on that. I don't know what to do, and I appreciate that input. Taking acreage out of production might have to be a solution for us. But if we add clover, if we rebuild with some of these warm season grasses, does it have to come out of production for that period of time in order to do the whole field? Or can, with proper fertilization and so forth, can you overseed and ask it to grow back? I'm a newbie at this. I have no idea what that answer could be. Thank you.
So that's a great question, ma'am. Thank you very much for that. So our strategy for managing tall fescue historically has been to dilute it out of our fields. And we've historically pursued a route of putting in a forb component, a legume, clover, as our means of diluting it. The problem that we've had with that system over time is that the lifespan of that clover in those fields is relatively short-lived. Now, it's a low-cost solution, but you're probably looking at, rebroadcasting clover seed out there every 3-ish years, 3 to 5 years tops. When you look at renovating to a native warm season grass or to a novel endophyte fescue, most would encourage you to pursue a route of basically what we would call a spray smother spray, or removing the killing off the old vegetation and then replanting new stuff to take its place. If you were to broadcast or interseed the warm season grasses or the novel endophyte fescue into an existing tall fescue patch, the question is competition, and are you going to get the new seedlings to establish in competition with the mature stand that's already there? The idea that you could pursue, rather than thinking about trying to do the whole field or the whole farm at once, is to renovate a quarter or a third of it at a time, where you take some of it out of production, but you don't take all of it out of production. And rather than trying to manage the whole thing at once, you bite it off into sections. And there, just to follow up, there's a comment that says the Kentucky 31 seed bank left over from old fescue fields is surprising, something to remember when renovating pastures. I completely agree with that as well. And that's why the spray, smother, spray. So spray to kill out the old fescue, plant a smother crop of a warm season annual or something, and then spray that out and then replant. That's why that practice has been promoted by the agronomists within the University of Missouri Extension, if you're going down the route of renovating to a different forage base in your pastures.
I come out of South Florida, where grasses are a major thing in ornamentals, and replacing grasses in those situations are somewhat akin to what you're talking about. So I can see possibilities. I just didn't know how to go about doing it. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Any other questions before we in for the evening and start up again next Thursday or Thursday night. Well, again, thank you all for being on tonight, and we'll call it a night and hope to see you back here Thursday night about 7 o'clock. So.
Thank you.